Hello everyone. In this video, I want to cover one of the most important topics on the road to World War II, which is basically how did people like Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini rose to power, right? These are people that today we kind of sort of even see as cartoonish villains, and sometimes it's difficult to understand, why or even how these people rose to power, right? And also, why did crazy ideologies like fascism became so popular during this time period, right? So World War II is one of the most fascinating, most interesting topics in the history of the world. And, the rise to power of its leaders, it's also very interesting. And there's a lot of lessons to be learned about it, right? So let's get started. And, to begin with, we need to understand that, we need to apply a lot of historical context to all of this, right? Because I think the reason a lot of people don't understand this or have a difficulty understanding this is because they think of people like Hitler or ideologies like fascism and they see them in a vacuum, right? They don't understand that these ideologies seem crazy to us in the present. However, in the 1920s and 30s, times were very different, right? So, in general, the answer is historical context. Okay, so for example, in the case of Adolf Hitler. Okay, so you need to understand that Hitler lived in a world that is post World War One, right? In this new created Weimar Republic. Now we need to understand that this Weimar Republic is the remnants of what used to be the German Empire, right? So this Weimar Republic, was set up for failure from the beginning, right? Because of the failures of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so we see this guilt clause, massive reparations, but also very important, the idea of losing territories and losing colonies, demilitarization. So in general, the German population were extremely humiliated by what happened after the First World War, right? So uh, the reason so many people have a difficult time understanding this idea of how did Hitler rise to power is because when you think of Hitler in a vacuum and you think about him in the present, well, in the present doesn't make sense if someone comes along and starts talking to you about, you know, humiliation, despair, times are difficult, blaming people, talking to you about this horrible situation. Well, in the present, you're not living this horrible situation. So if crazy person in the street approaches you and starts talking about these things, you're gonna see it as kind of like, what are you talking about, right? Like my life is kind of sort of like real good, right? I have a job, I go to school, I have a car, I have, I get paid well. I mean, you may be married, you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, right? So your life is good. So this rhetoric wouldn't resonate with you. It wouldn't make sense, right? And this is why people have a hard time understanding this idea of Hitler, right? Because you're thinking about him in the present or in a vacuum. So these ideas don't make sense in that way. But if you extrapolate that and you put it into 1920s Germany, that is a very different circumstance. So to understand the future actions of Germany after Hitler rises to power, I want to show you this map of post-war Germany, what was called the Weimar Republic, correct? So this is a map that shows pre-World War One Europe and post-World War One Europe. And so what you need to see is, for example, the German Empire, Austria-Hungary, uh, the Ottoman Empire. These places don't exist anymore, right? So the borders were redrawn after World War One. And for our purposes, I mean, you can check out, for example, countries like Hungary, like Czechoslovakia, Austria, Yugoslavia, Poland, Lithuania. These countries were created post World War One. And for our purposes, we need to focus on what happened to Germany. So let me pull up a different map that shows you specifically the grievances of Germany. Okay, so there's a couple of things that you need to pay attention to here. And the first one is that East Prussia over here still belongs to Germany, but is being separated by what was called the Polish corridor, right, which was ceded to Poland. There's a whole bunch of others, as you can see, like some of the boundaries, some given to Denmark. Some were given to Lithuania, Czechoslovakia. But for our interest, we need to focus a little bit more on the Polish corridor over here, seated to create what is today Poland, and also the Rhineland over here on the west. So the Rhineland still belonged to Germany, but it was demilitarized, meaning that Germany could not station any military forces here, basically because it's very close to France. So you can see France over here, and the idea is that France doesn't want to see any weapons from Germany close to their borders. And so this should help you understand why Hitler felt encircled and dismembered and betrayed by the people at the Treaty of Versailles. So this is going to fuel a lot of Hitler's resentment and some of the promises that he's going to make. The idea of he's going to undo the unfairness of the Treaty of Versailles, that he was going to restore their borders, that he was going to reunite the German people. Because if you think about it, the way they saw it, these people that were lost to, for example, areas in Lithuania, in the Polish corridor, Denmark, all these different territories. The way they see it, these people are ethnically German. So this is what Hitler meant when he wanted to unite the German people. And so, like I was mentioning earlier, the Weimar Republic was really not functioning, right? You can kind of like understand that as it was always doomed to fail, right? It had this huge debt for because of reparations. Uh, there's a lot of division, there's a lot of communist beliefs, and people who are very anti-communist. There are some people who believe in democracy. However, democracy is not working. There's unemployment, there's hyperinflation. This country is riddled with problems, right? People feel humiliated. Everything that we saw on the map, that the people are divided. It is pure chaos, right? So one of the ways to understand this is that in crazy circumstances, if the circumstances are so difficult, so harsh, you're letting the option of crazy outcomes coming out of it, right? So crazy scenario, crazy outcome, right? So in this environment of craziness, crazy people are going to happen, right? And this is where, Hitler becomes popular, right? He's a very good orator, and he's able to basically resonate a lot with the people when he's talking about them about the unfairness of the Treaty of Versailles. Look at all the problems that we have. We didn't really lose the war. If we could do it all over again, we were stabbed in the back. All these different myths and conspiracies that, were born post Treaty of Versailles, they resonate a lot with the people, right? Because the people feel humiliated and people feel like there needs to be a solution to all this craziness, right? And so in this environment, someone like Hitler, that to us sounds crazy, to them it doesn't sound as crazy. All right, to them it sounds like an actual viable solution. All right, and so what does Hitler promise these people? What are his philosophies that resonate so much with the people? In general, Hitler plans to restore the great German Empire, right? This Third Reich, all right? Reunite all the people, bring greatness back to Germany. And the idea is basically that Hitler is a fascist, right? So the question is, what does it mean to be a fascist? For me, the best way to explain the idea of fascism is to compare it to communism, right? And the reason I do this is because they're very opposite, but once you think about it, they're very similar also, right? And what I mean by this is that you need to differentiate between their methods versus their goals, right? So, for example, what you see with fascism and communism is that they have very similar methods, right? So, for example, authoritarian, dictatorial, um, repressive of political opposition, no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, propaganda. All these things I'm mentioning, I could be talking about the Nazis and I could be talking about the Soviets, right? They're very similar within each other, right? However, their goals are very different, right? And the goals, for example, for the communists are the redistribution of wealth and this idea of the workers' rights. Okay, that is their main goal. But if you think about it, everything else, authoritarian, dictatorial, repressive of freedom of speech, oppressive for any dissenting voice, you know, eliminating political opposition. All of these things also match the Nazis, right? And the difference between them is going to be that the Nazis have a very racial component, right? And this racial component for the Nazis is the idea of the Aryan race, that they believe that they have a superior race and that they're inherently better than everyone else, right? So this you can see it articulated by Hitler in his book that is called Mein Kampf, and in this book is where he basically elaborates the idea of, the hatred of the Jews, but also the plans for the future of the German Empire, right? So here's where you see the idea of what is called the Lebensraum, and I'm sorry, I don't speak German. I don't know how it's pronounced, but it's spelled Lebensraum, and it means living space. And basically, this idea is the whole replacing the entire population in East Europe, which would be mostly the Soviet Union. And when I mean replacing, I mean eliminating them and putting there more German people, right? The idea is that these people in East Europe were considered what they call Untermensch, right? Again, I don't speak German and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it basically means subhuman. There's a lot of people who are Jews, and most of the people that are communists. These people are considered inferior, right? These people are subhuman. So for them, this is a justification of we need to eliminate these people, replace them with Germans, and this place is gonna serve as a huge farmland where Germans can live there and produce and blah blah blah, for the purpose of the German. In addition, this Nazi ideology is predicated on the idea of two things, right? And these are German words that are very difficult to pronounce, and I'm not going to attempt, right? But the first one is the absolute loyalty to their leader, all right? Absolute loyalty. Okay, so there can be no political opposition, kind of sort of, right? The other one is the complete reunification of the ethnic German people. Okay, so under these two ideas, this is basically what the German population is buying from Hitler, right? Not only is the reunification of the German Empire, but it's also is basically saying, you all need to be loyal to me because I'm the only one who's able to do this, and this is really what the German people want at the time, right? Their reunification of the empire, the reunification of the German people, the ethnic German people, that they felt that they were separated and they're in different countries now, and is basically, you know, selling the idea of what the people want to hear, right? He knows this is what the German people have been suffering from, right? And he feels that they're being forced into this, right? And so I usually like to illustrate this presidential election of 1932 where Hitler lost the election. But the most significant thing about this, in my opinion, is to see that Hitler got 36.7% of the vote. This means 36% of the people in Germany agreed with the views of Hitler. Because don't think that he's hiding his motives. Don't think that he's saying one thing, but at the end he wants to become another. He's very outspoken about what he thinks. His opinion on the Jews, his opinion on, the Lebensraum, his opinion on, restoring the German greatness, the stab in the back myth, all those things. He's very outspoken about it. He's not hiding the fact of what are his motivations and his intentions. And, you know, it's crazy to think that 36.7% of the German population sided with Hitler and agreed with him, right? He may have lost this election, but the fact that so many people, a third of the German people, agreed with the sentiment is pretty crazy. And it is pretty crazy to think that there were other probably crazier things happening at the same time in different parts of the world, right? To give you very, very brief examples, right? You have, for example, Stalin in the Soviet Union, right? This idea of collectivization, this redistribution of wealth, the Great Purge, these events are going to lead to almost 20 million people deaths, right? So just in East Europe, right? Just by the hands of the Soviet Union, right? So this is probably a crazy error event happening at the same time, right? 1920s, early 1930s. At the same time, the Japanese in the Pacific also have very, very strong imperialistic ambitions in, creating this Japanese empire, right? So, uh, I think it's best if I show you the map just so you can see how Japan has been increasingly expanding for, I think it's from about 1931 to about 1940, 1942, right? So let me show you the map. Okay, so what you see here is the Japanese Empire by 1942. And so Japan is expanding pretty aggressively into these territories. You may not recognize them by these names today, but for example, French Indochina would be today Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. Siam is Thailand. Formosa is Taiwan. Manchuria is part of China. Korea, today's North Korea and South Korea. And all these territories were conquered by the Japanese in pretty brutal fashion, committing atrocities, forced labor, a lot of those different things. And in a spoiler alert, some of these people in Japan are eventually at the end of the war going to go to trial for crimes against humanity. And so one of the ways that I like to explain that, World War II is going to become kind of sort of inevitable is that, sometimes people like to play this game about, why would they do if they were to go back in time? And sometimes people say, if I could go back in time, I would try to, avoid World War II. And I would avoid World War II by killing Hitler, right? So my answer to that is usually that killing Hitler would not solve the problem, right? Because the reality is that Hitler is a symptom of a much bigger problem, right? The bigger problem being all these crazy circumstances caused by the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles, right? So my solution is usually that if you want to avoid World War II, you need to fix the problems caused by the Treaty of Versailles, right? So um, killing Hitler is not really going to solve the problems because I don't know if you know this, but there are much worse people than Hitler. You don't know if those people, in the crazy circumstances that the Treaty of Versailles left in Germany, you know, a crazy type of Hitler may rise to power, and it may be even worse, right? Uh, so that wouldn't be the solution, right? The solution would be again fixing the problems that come with a Treaty of Versailles. But I usually like to also say that it's kind of sort of inevitable because you know things are happening in Japan, like I explained earlier, right? And other things are happening in the Soviet Union, and maybe all those things are creating a cocktail of horrible things happening at the same time that we don't know how those things might interact in the future and causing this conflict to happen one way or another. But anyway, guys, this is all I have for you today. Let me know what you think. I'll be around and be safe. Okay, see y'all.